72 hours. That is how long forward Ukrainian artillery units can keep firing at current operational tempo without resupply. The resupply stopped 48 hours ago. The math is not complicated. Russia did not defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. It did not need to. It identified the single most critical vulnerability in NATO's entire support architecture: the 7 supply corridors through Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, through which 94% of all military hardware reaches Ukrainian forces, and destroyed all of them simultaneously. In one operational night, 400,000 Ukrainian troops are now in active combat positions across a 1,200-kilometer front line, without resupply, without ammunition, without the artillery shells, the drone components, the anti-tank missiles, the fuel that keeps a modern army fighting. 24 hours of artillery ammunition remaining in the most active eastern sectors. Not days, hours. Zelensky has requested an emergency ceasefire, not from a position of negotiation, from a position of operational collapse. And in Washington, the city that spent $175 billion, made promises of ironclad support, told the Ukrainian people they would have what they need for as long as it takes, the response is silence. The same silence that follows every moment when the gap between American commitments and American decisions becomes impossible to conceal. In this analysis, I will answer 4 questions. How did Russia identify and destroy every NATO supply corridor simultaneously, and what does that targeting precision tell us about Russian intelligence preparation? What does ammunition exhaustion actually mean for 400,000 troops in active combat, hour by hour, unit by unit? Why did Washington allow this to happen? And what does the absence of any coherent response tell us about the decisions made in the last 6 months that produced this outcome? And what does Zelensky's ceasefire request actually mean? Who controls the terms? And what does Ukraine look like on the other side of a ceasefire negotiated from ammunition exhaustion? Subscribe now. Share this with anyone trying to understand what these 48 hours actually mean. I read every comment. Let us get into the breakdown. NATO's military supply architecture for Ukraine was not designed to be vulnerable to simultaneous interdiction. It was designed with redundancy as its core principle. 7 separate corridors across 4 different NATO member states, different rail networks, different road systems, different border crossing infrastructure. The assumption was that no single strike or cluster of strikes could eliminate all 7 simultaneously. That assumption is now operationally obsolete. Russia's targeting operation against NATO supply infrastructure was not planned in weeks. The intelligence preparation behind it runs to a minimum of 2 years. Let me walk through what that targeting problem actually requires, because the difficulty is not immediately obvious. Each supply corridor consists of multiple interdependent elements: rail lines and road networks carrying the physical cargo, bridge infrastructure at river crossings, the single most efficient interdiction point on any overland supply route, tunnel sections that cannot be bypassed if destroyed, fuel depot and logistics hub infrastructure where cargo is transferred between transport modes, border crossing facilities where NATO member state infrastructure connects to Ukrainian rail gauge, a critical choke point because Ukrainian rail runs on a different gauge than Western European systems, requiring transfer facilities at every border crossing. Destroying a supply corridor permanently, not temporarily disrupting it, but eliminating it for weeks or months, requires destroying the elements that take longest to repair or replace. Bridges at critical river crossings, transfer facilities at border gauge change points, tunnel sections whose reconstruction requires specialized equipment with long procurement timelines. Russia identified and struck all of those elements across all 7 corridors within a 6-hour operational window beginning at 11:47 p.m. local time. The strike package was the most complex, coordinated, conventional strike operation Russia has executed in this conflict. Caliber cruise missiles launched from submarines in the Black Sea and Caspian Sea addressed the deep targets, the bridge structures and tunnel sections requiring precision munitions with range sufficient to reach targets in western Ukraine and near the Polish and Slovak borders. Iskander-M ballistic missiles from launch positions in Belarus addressed the border-crossing transfer facilities, targets requiring the terminal precision that the Iskander's maneuvering re-entry vehicle provides. Shahed 136 loitering munitions in coordinated packages of 8 to 12 weapons addressed the logistics hub infrastructure, fuel depots, cargo transfer facilities, equipment staging areas, at locations distributed across the supply network. The targeting precision across all 7 corridors confirms a database assembled through years of systematic collection. Commercial satellite imagery analysis tracking cargo movement patterns along supply routes. Signals intelligence identifying the electronic signatures of logistics management systems at transfer facilities. Human intelligence sources within the contractor networks that operate the logistics infrastructure, the trucking companies, the rail operators, the fuel suppliers whose operations interface with military supply chains at multiple points. The simultaneous execution was operationally essential. It prevented NATO logistics planners from rerouting cargo from affected corridors to surviving ones. By the time the first strike impacts were confirmed, all 7 corridors were already struck. There was no surviving corridor to reroute through. Post-strike assessment confirms the following. The Przemysl rail hub in Poland, the single largest cargo transfer point in the entire Ukraine supply network, processing approximately 40% of all military hardware deliveries, is non-operational following strikes on its gauge change transfer facilities. Reconstruction timeline, minimum 8 weeks. The 4 primary bridge crossings over the Dniester, southern Bu, and Dnieper tributaries on the main western supply routes have been destroyed. Reconstruction timeline, 6 to 14 weeks, depending on span and construction access. The border crossing transfer facilities at Medyka, Uzhhorod, and Chop are destroyed. These are the points where NATO gauge rail cargo transfers to Ukrainian gauge rolling stock. Without them, rail supply from NATO territory to Ukrainian rail network is physically impossible, regardless of what is loaded on trains in Poland or Slovakia. The operational result is complete. Not 60% degradation of supply capacity, not significant disruption requiring days to overcome. Complete elimination of the overland supply architecture that has sustained Ukrainian military operations for 2 years, achieved in 6 hours. 400,000 Ukrainian troops are currently deployed across active operational sectors. They are not uniformly distributed, and their ammunition consumption rates are not uniform. Understanding what ammunition exhaustion actually means requires looking at specific force categories and their specific consumption rates. Artillery. Ukraine currently operates approximately 600 artillery systems across the eastern and southern fronts, a combination of Soviet-era 152mm systems, NATO standard 155mm howitzers, and self-propelled systems including the Caesar, PZH-2000, and M109. Under current operational tempo, collective daily artillery ammunition consumption runs at approximately 5,000 to 7,000 rounds per day. At that consumption rate, artillery units exhaust their forward ammunition stockpiles, the shells physically present at battery positions and immediate resupply points, within 48 to 72 hours of resupply cessation. Artillery is not simply a weapon system in Ukrainian military doctrine. It is the foundation of defensive operations. Ukrainian defensive tactics are built around the principle of artillery suppression, using artillery fire to prevent Russian infantry from advancing, to destroy armored vehicles before they reach defensive positions, and to interdict Russian logistics and reinforcement movements behind the front line. When artillery ammunition is exhausted, that entire defensive architecture collapses. Russian infantry can advance under conditions they cannot advance under when artillery is operational. The timeline for the Eastern Front's primary defensive artillery units reaching exhaustion began 48 hours ago. Forward units in the most active sectors, the Zaporizhia Axis, the Avdiivka sector, the Kherson Front, are approaching that threshold now. Anti-tank systems. Ukraine operates a combination of Javelin, NLAW, Stugna-P, and Kornet anti-tank guided missile systems. These are the weapons that stopped Russian armored advances in the early phases of the conflict. Their effectiveness depends entirely on available rounds. An anti-tank team with no missiles is not a defensive asset. It is infantry without the capability that makes it operationally relevant against armored attack. Anti-tank missile stockpiles at forward positions are smaller than artillery stockpiles, measured in tens of rounds per unit rather than hundreds. They deplete faster under high-intensity contact. Drone components. This is the element of Ukrainian military supply dependency that receives the least public attention and carries the most immediate operational consequence. Ukrainian military operations are built around continuous drone reconnaissance and attack capability. The drones themselves, primarily FPV attack drones assembled in Ukrainian facilities, require a continuous supply of electronic components, propulsion systems, and explosive payloads that come entirely from external supply chains. When those supply chains are cut, drone production stops within days. When drone production stops, the reconnaissance picture that Ukrainian commanders depend on for every tactical decision degrades immediately. Operations planned on the assumption of continuous drone surveillance are being conducted without it. Fuel. Ukrainian armored and mechanized units consume approximately 400,000 liters of diesel per day across the active front. Fuel stockpiles at forward positions support approximately 5 to 7 days of operations without resupply. The fuel clock started 48 hours ago. Forward armored units in the most active sectors are approaching the operational threshold below which mobility becomes restricted. The cumulative effect of simultaneous depletion across these four categories is not a linear degradation of combat effectiveness. It is a cascading collapse. Artillery exhaustion removes the suppression that enables infantry to hold positions. Anti-tank depletion removes the defense against armored breakthrough. Drone cessation removes the situational awareness that makes tactical decisions reliable. Fuel depletion removes the mobility that allows units to reposition in response to breakthrough threats. Each category's exhaustion accelerates the impact of the others. An infantry unit holding a defensive position without artillery support, without anti-tank missiles, without drone reconnaissance, and with immobile armored support is not a defensive force. It is a collection of soldiers in positions that Russian forces can approach, identify, and engage under conditions of their choosing. Zelensky's ceasefire request was not a political decision. It was the operational recognition that the force structure supporting Ukrainian territorial control is entering a collapse sequence that no political statement can stop. I want to be direct about this because the official explanations will not be. The destruction of NATO's supply corridors to Ukraine did not happen because Russia developed a capability that American intelligence failed to detect. It happened because American intelligence detected the preparation for exactly this operation, and the decisions required to prevent it were not made. The warning indicators were in the collection stream for a minimum of 6 months. Russian procurement of specialized long-range precision munitions at volumes exceeding normal operational replenishment. Positioning of Iskander launch units in Belarus at coordinates optimized for Western Ukraine and border region targeting. Signals intelligence indicating Russian targeting analysis of NATO logistics infrastructure in Poland and Slovakia. Commercial imagery showing Russian strike planning activity consistent with a large-scale coordinated conventional strike on fixed infrastructure targets. Those indicators produced assessments. The assessments produced recommendations. The recommendations produced the specific institutional friction that I have watched produce intelligence failures across 3 decades. The friction between what the collection says and what the decision-makers are prepared to act on. Acting on those recommendations required 2 things that the current political environment in Washington made unavailable. Pre-positioning of American military assets in Poland and Romania at a scale sufficient to deter Russian strike execution, a step that the administration assessed as escalatory in the context of ongoing ceasefire negotiations. And emergency stockpiling of supply corridor redundancy, alternative supply infrastructure capable of absorbing the volume of the primary corridors if they were struck, a step that required funding authorization that Congress did not provide in the timeline the operational situation required. Both decisions were deferred. The reasons given internally were process reasons: escalation risk assessment, budget cycle constraints, interagency coordination timelines. The operational consequence of those deferrals is 400,000 troops without resupply and a ceasefire request from a government that has no other option. The $175 billion that American taxpayers provided to Ukrainian defense since February 2022 was not wasted on the battlefield. Ukrainian forces used it with a tactical effectiveness that surprised every professional military analyst, including myself. It was made irrelevant in 6 hours by the destruction of the infrastructure through which the next dollar of support would have flowed. That outcome was not inevitable. It was the product of specific decisions. Decisions not to pre-position, decisions not to stockpile redundancy, decisions to defer the operational preparations that the warning indicators said were necessary. Those decisions were made in Washington by people who will not be identified in any public accountability process and whose names will not appear in any of the official reviews that follow this failure. The silence from Washington this morning is not the silence of an institution formulating its response. It is the silence of an institution that knows exactly what decisions produced this outcome and has not yet determined how to describe those decisions to a public that spent $175 billion on a commitment that has now collapsed. Zelensky's emergency ceasefire request was transmitted through back channels to Washington, Brussels and Berlin at 6:14 a.m. Kyiv time. It was not the ceasefire request of a government negotiating from strength. It was the ceasefire request of a military command that has run the ammunition arithmetic and determined that the alternative to ceasefire is operational collapse on the Eastern Front within 96 hours. Understanding what a ceasefire negotiated under these conditions actually means requires understanding who controls the terms. A ceasefire request, transmitted by the side facing ammunition exhaustion, is not a negotiating position. It is a signal of operational desperation that the receiving party, Russia, reads with precision. Moscow has spent 3 years waiting for exactly this signal. The entire Russian operational strategy since the failure of the 2022 Kyiv offensive has been oriented toward the attrition of Ukrainian military supply capacity to the point where continued resistance becomes operationally impossible and ceasefire on Russian terms becomes the only available option. That point has now been reached. Not through battlefield victory, through logistics interdiction, through the patient, systematic destruction of the supply architecture that sustained Ukrainian resistance. The terms Russia will present in any ceasefire negotiation reflect the territorial and political reality that exists at the moment negotiations begin. That reality, as of this morning, includes Russian control of approximately 18% of Ukrainian territory. Crimea, most of Luhansk Oblast, significant portions of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts. Russian forces positioned along a front line that, without Ukrainian artillery resupply, they can advance in the coming days. And a Ukrainian military whose ammunition exhaustion creates time pressure that favors the Russian negotiating position with every hour that passes without agreement. The ceasefire terms Russia will demand are not the terms that Ukrainian or Western governments have publicly stated as acceptable. They will include territorial recognition of Russian control over current occupied areas, restrictions on Ukrainian military size, equipment, and alliance membership that constitute neutralization of Ukraine as a military threat to Russian interests, and the absence of accountability mechanisms for the conduct of the war, the specific element that Ukrainian civil society and Western human rights organizations have identified as non-negotiable. Those terms will be presented as the alternative to continued military operations against a force that has run out of ammunition. The negotiating dynamic that ammunition exhaustion creates does not favor Ukrainian rejection of those terms. It favors acceptance. What Ukraine looks like on the other side of this ceasefire is a state with reduced territory, constrained sovereignty, and the permanent geopolitical question of whether the Western security architecture that failed to sustain its supply lines can be trusted to sustain any future commitment to Ukrainian security. That question will be asked in Warsaw, in Tallinn, in Vilnius, in every NATO capital whose security planning rests on the assumption that American commitment means operational support when the operational situation requires it. The answer that this morning's events provide is not the answer those governments have been banking on. In 30 years of military analysis, I have watched supply chain failures produce military collapses that no amount of tactical skill or unit courage could prevent. The pattern is consistent. Modern military forces are not defeated by superior enemy tactics. They are defeated by the systematic elimination of the logistics foundation that makes their tactics executable. Russia understood that principle and applied it with a patience and precision that the Western analytical community consistently underestimated, because the assumption that Russia's military was operationally exhausted made the intelligence indicators less alarming than they should have been. 400,000 troops, 7 supply corridors destroyed, 48 hours of ammunition remaining in the most active sectors. A ceasefire request transmitted through back channels at 6:14 a.m., and a Washington that spent $175 billion on a commitment it did not protect when protecting it required the decisions that the political environment made unavailable. The operational question for the next 72 hours is whether emergency airlift, the only supply mechanism that does not depend on the destroyed corridor infrastructure, can deliver ammunition at volumes sufficient to slow the exhaustion timeline while ceasefire negotiations produce an agreement. The physical answer is no. American and NATO heavy airlift capacity operating at maximum sustainable rates can deliver approximately 2,000 tons of cargo per day to Ukrainian airfields. The daily ammunition requirement for 400,000 troops in active combat exceeds 8,000 tons. Airlift addresses 25% of the requirement at maximum effort. It slows the collapse. It does not stop it. The strategic question, the question that Warsaw and Tallinn and every NATO capital is asking this morning, is what the destruction of Ukrainian supply infrastructure and the American response to it means for the credibility of every other commitment Washington has made to every other ally that depends on American support being operationally real when the operational situation requires it. That question does not have a comfortable answer. And the silence from Washington this morning is not a step toward providing one. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every response. If this breakdown delivered the depth you came for, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next update is already being prepared. Stay with me.